I'd like to hand over to Stuart Wildman, who's the chair of the History of Nursing Forum, to introduce the event.
Hello, everybody. My name's Stuart Wildman, as Sarah's just said. I'm the chair of the History of Nursing Forum, and welcome to our annual lecture. If you are a member of the RCN and you want to join the forum, then I think Teresa or Sarah will put up the details in the chat. And you can be a member of as many forums as you like, so we would welcome you to the History of Nursing Forum. The RCN is a UK membership organisation, but it's great to have people from all around the world for this event today. And it will be recorded and it will be available for people to look at after the event. You're probably already familiar with Zoom, but I'll just go through a few things you might need to know for the event. You will be muted during the event, and also please turn off your videos during the talk to reduce bandwidth. There'll be an opportunity after the talk to ask questions. You can either do this by using your electronic hand on the menu, or typing into the chat. Please avoid typing in the chat during the talk, as this is distracting both for the speaker and for other attendees. If you're having trouble with Zoom, try leaving the event and logging back in on the same link. There will be automatically generated captions during the talk. You can turn these on or off by clicking the CC button and then show or hide subtitle. Now, I'm really pleased to welcome you to this event, and I'd like to introduce Odette Best, our speaker for today, all the way from Australia. If you're here in the UK, or if you're in Australia, she's one of your own. Odette Best is a Wakgun clan member of the Gorreng Gorreng Nation and holds a Boonthamurra bloodline with adoption ties to Koomumberri Yugambeh People. Odette is a professor and associate head of the Indigenous Research and Community Engagement at the School of Nursing and Midwifery at the University of Southern Queensland. She commenced her training in the 1980s at Princess Alexandra Hospital, Brisbane, and went on to work clinically for more than a decade in the Brisbane Aboriginal Medical Service and Boggo Road Women's Prison. Odette further holds a Bachelor of Health Science, Master of Philosophy, and a PhD. It was whilst undertaking her PhD on Aboriginal women as registered nurses in Queensland, 1950 to 2000, that her passion was realised in uncovering the largely untold historiography. Odette is currently the Primary Investigator on an Australian Research Council grant in uncovering Aboriginal women as nurses and midwives from the 1890s to the 1940s in Queensland. She is a Churchill Fellow, 2002, a Fellow of the American Academy of Nursing, 2018, and a Fellow of the Australian College of Nurses, 2021. She is passionate at uncovering and documenting Aboriginal women's nursing and midwifery histories. So with no more to do, I'll let Odette start on our annual History of Nursing lecture. Over to you, Odette.
Thank you very much for that, Stuart. Thank you for the welcome, and thank you everybody for the opportunity to be speaking tonight. It's about 9:10 on Monday evening here in Ipswich, and it's a very rainy night. So I'm listening to the rain fall, which is lovely. So the title of my talk tonight is Yatdjuligin, Aboriginal Nurses and Midwives, Voices from the Colony. The word Yatdjuligin is from my grandmother's language, Wakgun language of the Gorreng Gorreng Nation. We are a matrilineal nation. My grandmother is our current matriarch. She's, we think about 105, 106. And this is one of her words. And Yatdjuligin means learning in a good way, but it also means that learning can be hard and it can be difficult. And at times it can be having to push through. So I thought it was really appropriate to name the talk this evening tonight. So firstly, I would like to acknowledge my ancestors and my elders and the custodians of the land of which I am on tonight, which is the land of the Yugambeh People. I would also like to pay my respect to the Aboriginal nurses, and there are many who went before me. For tonight's talk, guys, we had a few technical issues to begin with. So I believe that Sarah will be clicking onto the slides when I say click. Ordinarily, I would have had control, but we just had a few issues. So Sarah, please, the second slide. Just to give everybody a little bit of context, because I'm not sure if everyone's been to Australia or knows a lot about Indigenous Australians or First Nations Australians. This is what's called the Map of Indigenous Australia that was essentially undertaken by an anthropologist way back in the 1920s and 30s called Norman Tyndale. Essentially what it represents is the approximately, because we know that there are mistakes made in it, but it's a pretty okay crack at it. We know that there's approximately 250 sovereign nations pre-invasion and pre-colonisation, and that there's approximately 500 languages. I hold 2 Indigenous bloodlines. I'm gifted through a set of grandparents, Gorreng Gorreng and Boonthamurra, and through my adopted father, I'm acknowledged as a member of the Koomumberri Yugambeh Nation. In today's neo-colonial terms for what is now called Australia, that means I am a true Queenslander. Next slide, please, Sarah. So the historiography of Indigenous nurses, certainly within Australia, is yet to be fully realised. There is a dearth of research, publication, or interrogation as to why this is the positioning of such rich and complex women's histories. The purpose of today's or this evening's presentation is to make visible Indigenous women's contributions to the nursing and midwifery professions from the 1890s to the 1950s. This is done as an intercept to historical discourses that have rendered these ethnographies largely invisible. This is a new and burgeoning theme in nurse and midwife histories. In setting the scene for today, I first outlined the particular acts of administration that overwhelmingly, but not all, Aboriginal people lived under at this time. This, of course, was the Protectionist and Segregationist Act, which were enacted between roughly the 1870s to the 1950s. Laying this foundation, I then present a snapshot of 3 Aboriginal women who were nurses within this era. Firstly, Doreen Busan, who was the first Aboriginal woman on Woorabinda Mission, and Woorabinda Mission is in central Queensland, and it is the mission that my entire family were removed to, starting with my great-grandparents. She was trained under what is called the Native Nurses Training Scheme. The Native Nurses Training Scheme was operationalised on 3 missions in Queensland and was only for Aboriginal women, administered under the Acts. Secondly, I present the history of Muriel Stanley, who was also administered under an Act on Yarrabah Mission in North Queensland. She became a midwife at South Sydney Women's Hospital and was then exempt from the Act. And thirdly, May Yarowick, who wasn't administered under an Act at all and became a midwife at Crown Street in Sydney. This slide here shows you the basic acts of and the time frame of when the acts were administered within Australia. But now I'll focus in for everyone. So what is meant by the acts of administration? Since invasion and subsequent colonisation, Indigenous Australians have been administered under a number of acts of parliament imposed via legislative processes. As you can see from the slide, there is an overlap in some of the earlier acts with the dates that they were administered. This is due in difference to the states and the territories of Australia commencing and ceasing them at different times. The harshest of these acts, which impacted upon Indigenous Australians most notably, is arguably the era of protectionism and segregation. Although I'm sure the Indigenous peoples of the Northern Territory would probably strongly argue against this with the introduction of the Northern Territory intervention occurring. This saw the 1975 Australian Racial Discrimination Act suspended at 2:07 in the morning in 2007. This legislation is still currently running today. By suspending the Act, it meant that the Australian government could get through race-based legislation only aimed at Indigenous Australians. After a number of months, this act was reenacted or brought back up. However, I digress. The protectionist and segregationist acts of the 1870s until the 1950s saw the development of missions and reserves right across Australia, which saw mass forced removal of Indigenous peoples onto them. Next slide, please, Sarah. In Queensland, it was at this time Aboriginal people entered the heinous and racially determined era of the Queensland Act, which was called the Aboriginal Protection and the Restriction of the Sale of Opium Act. Queensland being the only state within Australia to include Aboriginal people and drugs in the same act. Opium was a rising concern amongst the Chinese immigrants who were coming into Australia due to various gold rushes, and it was deemed easier to push the two issues into the one act and pass it through legislation in Queensland. As Queensland only has one house, we don't have an upper house in Queensland. So it's a unicameral parliament, meaning that there is just one house, the Legislative Assembly. It was considered that it would be the easiest state to pass it through, and so they did. Next slide, please. When enacted, the Act authorised mass removal of Aboriginal people from their traditional homelands to missions managed by either church or government. And this was purely done for the land use that was required for the developing industries of agriculture and cattle. A chief protector was nominated because Aboriginal people were legislated as wards of the state. This ensured that mass relocations could occur without any retribution. Throughout Queensland, non-Aboriginal people were appointed as district protectors or mission superintendents and were given the powers under the Act to decide where and how Aboriginal people were to live, where Aboriginal people were to work, when or if Aboriginal people could practice cultural ceremonies, whom Aboriginal people could marry, whether and when Aboriginal people could move on and off the settlements, removal of children and removal of wages, and whether Aboriginal people were imprisoned without any offence at all. Only minimal education was offered to Aboriginal children. Aboriginal girls who reached around the age of about approximately 12 years were sent across Queensland to work as domestic servants on white-owned cattle stations and within white homes. They had no choice about this work, often were not paid, and suffered sexual and physical abuses. This era saw a devastating decline in the health of Indigenous peoples, with the severancy of many of our traditional health and our traditional medicines due to them being seen as the devil's work and having very little value. Interestingly now, two of Australia's large exports, being tea tree oil and eucalyptus oil, are both Aboriginal medicines and therefore Indigenous knowledges, but little acknowledgement or kudos has ever been given for this. It was under this era that there was very little opportunity afforded for Aboriginal women to be allowed to undertake nursing or midwifery within mainstream hospitals and off the missions. Movement on and off the missions was mostly prohibited unless you were being sent out for domestic service. In some cases, for Aboriginal women who went into nursing or midwifery, denial of their Aboriginality occurred. And these women, who usually had a white parent, commonly a father, had to apply for exemptions from the Act and signed paperwork that they would cease identifying as Aboriginal and were not allowed to socialise with Aboriginal people nor go back to the mission and visit their family. It was this Act that has been argued was the template for South African apartheid. Next slide, please, Sarah. The belief that blood quantums was a defining factor of Aboriginality was prevalent at this time. This era scientifically was bound to the ever popular eugenics movement. Common belief was that Aboriginality could be bred out, and the usage of blood quantum language became very common, such as full blood, half caste, quadroon, and octoroon. After Octoroon, it was believed that you would cease identifying as Aboriginal. The missions and reserves were often set up to depict this. So the top photo on this slide shows the half-caste dormitory where children who had white fathers were separated from their Aboriginal mothers and housed until they could be sent out as domestics or stockmen. If you look up on the veranda, on the far right, my right-hand side, the second child is actually that of my grandmother. The widening disparities of living conditions between full bloods and half castes soon became apparent on the settlements and was growing, as was the decline in our health. The bottom photo on this slide is of the full bloods camp. It needs to be noted that this language of blood quantum is highly unacceptable language to the Aboriginal communities today. The photo on the bottom of the slide is that of my grandfather. So my grandfather is that cheeky little boy sitting on the end with his hands or his elbows on his knees. By the 1940s, some government officials started recording these disparities and questioning the administration of what was occurring on these missions. Slide 7, please, Sarah. The missions had minimal white staff attached, but this did usually include a teacher, a matron, the superintendent, their spouses and children, and sometimes visiting medical officers. It also usually included within the staff what was called the native police, but that's a whole other presentation unto itself. On some missions, a white school was also established for the children of the administrators. The missions had small hospitals, usually run by a matron and white nursing staff, but this at times proved exceedingly difficult to recruit white nurses to work in. Traditional medicines were seen as the devil's work and was punishable if caught practicing. However, the usage of Aboriginal women within the mission hospitals at times was substantial, and at many times they kept the hospitals open. It was during the beginning of the 1940s that the matron of Woorabinda, who was the woman on the far left of this screen, left Woorabinda. Matron Hempstead. She was vicious. She was absolutely vicious. And my grandmother still tells stories about her today. She was a terrible, terrible woman. However, what occurred shortly after that was that Matron Joan College commenced at Woorabinda Hospital in 1942. Now, interestingly, Matron College was the daughter of the first superintendent of Woorabinda, Mr. College, and he is in the centre of this photo. I find this particularly noteworthy as it was the visiting microbiologist to Woorabinda, Dr. Johnson, who in 1943 reported to the State Protector of Aborigines in Queensland that the appalling conditions and the high death rates of Woorabinda were in part due to the staff, who were made up of 3 officers of the department who are too fond of drinking, a mentally unstable matron, and a professionally negligent medical officer. He was particularly scathing of the mission superintendent and described Mr. College as an uncouth individual, fond of complaining and rather addicted to alcohol. However, Matron College would eventually take the reins, his daughter, who had been educated at Woorabinda in the white children's school. She had left to complete both her general nursing and her midwifery training. On completion, she returned to Woorabinda to take up the position of matron. In her correspondence to the Director of Native Affairs in Brisbane, Matron College's correspondence outlined a nursing scheme that she wanted to introduce for Aboriginal girls who showed an interest in nursing. They would be put on probation for 3 months and, if satisfactory, would sign on for 2 years. During training, the native nurses, as they were called, would receive lectures by the sometimes present medical officer and the matron on all nursing subjects. This included things like general nursing, obstetrics, child welfare, nutrition, hygiene, and anatomy. The native nurses would also be required to sit periodical, practical and written examinations, and that at the termination of the 2 years of training, and provided that they successfully passed their set exams, the trainee would be issued with a certificate or badge of efficiency. It was expected that after 2 years of hospital work, lectures, etc., these girls would be a great asset to the hospital staff. Next slide, please, Sarah. So in August of 1945, Matron College, after writing letters for 2 years, received notification through the superintendent, who was still her father, and she was advised that the scheme relative to the above and as outlined by Hospital Matron College in the training of native nurses on the staff of the Woorabinda Settlement Hospital had been approved. The matron is to furnish monthly reports on their progress to the office. These candidates would wear full uniform. On Woorabinda, Matron College employed 2 girls initially, Gwen Doyle and Doreen Busan. They were first to commence their duties. They commenced their duties on the 12th of September 1945. Matron College had this to write: I wish to advise that Doreen Busan and Gwen Doyle, the chosen assistants, are at present doing very well and are a great asset to the hospital. They are at present doing alternative shifts in the ward and our outpatients department. The native nurses would be required to undertake periodical written and prac exams, as I've already said, and they will be trained to take care of the sick, sponging helpless cases, making beds, sweeping wards, taking temperatures in the earlier months of their training. Later in their training, they were to undertake dressings, doing bandaging, urine testing, and other necessary treatments. They were to be lectured also in hospital etiquette. After the 2 years of hospital work, these girls would be a great asset to the mission hospital and could be transferred to other settlements if necessary. They were to be given the usual nursing duty, and with their days off weekly, they should be able to obtain more practical skills if they so wished. They were also considered to be incredibly experienced nurses. Matron College stated that the trainees would be absolutely crucial to the running of the mission hospital. Her plan was to train native nurses who could work under the supervision of white nurses and could provide healthcare for only Indigenous patients. The nurses who were trained under college's program would be able to work on Woorabinda, not in other hospitals, and their qualifications on completion of the 2 years was not recognised at all as a nursing qualification by mainstream hospitals, unions, nor were they to be registered at all. The native nurses training schemes appeared within the reports of the Director of Native Affairs in Queensland over the years consistently. The 3 identified missions being Woorabinda, Palm Island and Cherbourg had various levels of success. Not surprisingly, at times it was the lack of white staff to continue with the lecturing of nurses that proved the most problematic. The successes of these schemes were also reported really unusually within mainstream media, including things like the 1947 Women's Weekly. They also consistently were reported upon by the visiting medical officers, who one in particular in his 1949 report noted that another encouraging thing is the high results obtained in the examination papers to test their knowledge of nursing subjects. The teaching follows closely the curriculum of the great teaching hospitals. Next slide, please, Sarah. Now the lovely and amazing Muriel Stanley, one of my favourite. She is a Wapabara woman, so that means she also comes from Magnetic Island off the coast of Queensland. Muriel Stanley was born under the Act on the 6th of April 1918 at Yarrabah Mission, Queensland. She was the daughter of Aboriginal parents Luke Stanley and his wife Jessie Ross. Muriel decided that she could do more for her people as a nurse, but because of racism against her colour, she found difficulty in realising her ambition. Essentially, No hospital in Queensland would accept her to train as she was just too black. She was eventually accepted by the South Sydney Women's Hospital, where she completed an 18-month course and passed the final examination in November of 1944 and was registered as an obstetrics-only nurse in March of 1945. On completion of her training, she automatically received an exemption from being under the Act. This exemption was not of her own initiation, though, but was on occasion afforded to Aborigines who were seen as noteworthy. This meant that she could travel from Sydney back to Yarrabah Mission on a train and would not be arrested or locked up as an itinerant Aborigine. This was a truly repressive time and regime that ruled over the lives of Aboriginal peoples. However, her training matron wrote in her recommendation letter, "It had been a true pleasure to train her." Muriel loved being back home and nursing on Yarrabah as the matron. She did continue some of her missionary work and even travelled to London to learn to become a missionary even more so. During this time, Muriel was interviewed by the then publication produced in New South Wales called Dawn or Dawn magazine on a number of occasions. It was a magazine that was produced in Sydney for a number of years for Aboriginal people across the missions and reserves. Slide 10, please. Sister Muriel's first story was published in Dawn magazine in 1955. Her story was titled Aboriginal Nurse Honoured. It outlined Stanley's move from her Yarrabah mission home, her acceptance into obstetric nursing at South Sydney Women's Hospital in Camperdown, and her move back to Yarrabah to take up the matron's position. Stanley's voice came through in a small quote at the end of the article, and she said, "You are always reading and hearing that we are a backward race. I felt it was time some of us pushed forward and let the world see what could be done. I do think it's time the white Australians realised what they owe the Australian Aborigine." It is possible that Stanley's article in New Dawn represents the first health activist voice for Aboriginal health, which came from a Western qualified Aboriginal health professional. This snapshot of Stanley was brief, but important. Here was an Aboriginal matron, which was unheard of at the time, even on the missions, making a strong political statement about non-Indigenous Australians taking a responsibility for the legacy of not understanding Aboriginal people. Slide 11, please. Stanley, as she was affectionately called, had a reputation of a firm hand and of most student nurses or sisters being a little bit scared and some even being intimidated by her. Valerie Griffith, a newly registered nurse, travelled up to Yarrabah in the early 50s and had this to say of Stanley. "I met Stanley as she was chasing two of the young lads with a broomstick in hand along the hospital veranda, letting them know she'll give them what for if they don't stop that shit." Valerie was very intimidated, but she also much admired the work of Muriel and her clinical skills. Muriel did her rounds throughout the community on horseback and often visited Cairns Base Hospital, where she was well received by the white matron. Stanley passed away in 1979 as a much loved and very respected Aboriginal midwife in Queensland. It is Muriel's story that adds depth to the history of nursing in Australia. She succeeded in defying the restrictions imposed by the Act and challenging the racist ideologies that considered her untrainable. Her contribution to the Aboriginal midwifery labour workforce within Aboriginal community context is unquestionable. However, she was released from the limitations of the Act once she was granted an exemption, which she received because of her noteworthy achievement of being registered as a midwife. The fact that a full-blood Aborigine could be trained as a midwife was considered as exceptional. Muriel demonstrated her agency by her persistence in seeking a way to achieve training and also her registration. She marked herself as an activist, not a passive bystander, when she demanded that white Australians realise what they owed the Aborigine. Slide 12, please, Sarah. My last Aboriginal midwife that I want to present to you tonight is ongoing work that I've been doing for a number of years, and she is truly incredible. It was on Stony Creek Station, New South Wales in February of 1876 that May Yarowick was born. There is little information on May's Aboriginal family. However, through oral history of May's white family, the Kellys, it is said that May was from the Yarowick tribe who passed through Stony Creek property seasonally. May's Aboriginal grandmother went into labour whilst this was occurring and whilst the Yarowick people were on Stony Creek. The labour was proving incredibly difficult, but both mother and daughter survived after assistance from Mrs. Catherine Kelly, who found the baby's arm was caught. The baby grew up in the kitchen and was named Peg. Peg's mother returned to the Yarowick people as they passed back through Stony Creek some 2 years later. But baby Peg ran back to Mrs. Catherine Kelly, and this is where she stayed. So Peg was reared here in the Kelly homestead. At 16, Peg gave birth to a baby who they named May. May had very recognisable Kelly paternity, but Mrs. Catherine Kelly at this time could not get any of her 5 sons to own up to whose child it was. May was baptised by a Catholic priest and was given the name May. They didn't know what surname to give her as she was still considered an illegitimate child, and there was still discrepancy as to which Kelly son was her father. So with the belief that it had been the Yarowick people that were going through the property seasonally and approximately every 2 years, that this would become her last name. May was educated with many of her white cousins and was afforded the same privilege as them, such as private tutors. May's second cousin, Ms. Mickey Hardy, had this to say about May. May was 16 and she was very, very bright, but very, very plain. She looked like a wizened little monkey, carrying all the characteristics of the Aboriginal people, with the broad overhanging forehead and the flattish nose, but there was also so much of the Kelly in her. At any rate, May was brilliant. She did very well at school, better than any of us, and so they decided to give her vocation or some training. May didn't lean towards the church, so it was arranged to send her to Crown Street in Sydney, hopefully to train as an obstetrics nurse. So May went off to Sydney and was looked after at this time by John Kelly, who lived in Neutral Bay in Sydney. May secured an interview at Crown Street Women's Hospital. And after the interview, the matron wrote up the following note. Next slide, please. This is the actual, a copy, of course, of the note that the matron, after interviewing May, wrote to the hospital board of Crown Street Hospital. Letter to Crown Street Women's Hospital Board from the matron regarding pupil nurse Yarowick, dated the 28th of May, 1906. Excuse me. It was decided that the fact of her being half caste was not a valid ground in refusing to train her as a nurse. A separate room, however, would be provided for her. May's working history is as a travelling midwife in and throughout the Inverell, Bundara and Tenga districts of New South Wales. We do know via family diaries that May was famous throughout the whole of the north for her brilliant midwifery ability and for the number of women and babies that she saved. The women on the various stations and properties always engaged May before their babies were born, and she lived in the houses and delivered the children. When Miriam Broom, who was May's first cousin and she had grown up with, was having her own children back on Stony Creek, of course, cousin May was called for. May delivered Miriam's child and she was hemorrhaging very badly. And so I quote direct from May's cousin's diary. May gave order for ropes, you know, the leg ropes that they used in the cattle yards. And she tied Miriam's ankles and hitched them up to the bed post that she was almost like hanging upside down. Then she put one hand inside of Miriam and with the other hand on the pressure point on the outside, she knelt on the bed and held that pressure point until she stemmed the flow of blood. She sat there and held that position for over an hour. For whatever happened, for whatever reason, she just would not stand up. She would not let go of the position until the bleeding completely stopped. And I suppose a blood clot formed. And we think that this is what saved Miriam's life. In fact, May was often heard to boast that she had never lost a child and she had never lost a mother in all of the days of her midwifery care. Next slide, please. It is apparent through letters to her family that May, whilst based in Sydney, intermittently throughout her nursing career, longed to go home and to the bush and to her white family. As an older woman, May, in a letter to her cousin, wrote, and I quote, "Dear Katie, just a line or two. I have a great wish to come back home to the bush, that is to stay with you for a while. I have the money. My fixed term deposit opens on the 6th of June at the Bank of Australasia. So what do you think? There are hospitals in Inverell and I do not wish to die in Sydney. I want the bush. I want Bundara. It is my heritage. It is my life. Here in Sydney, the minute a white father or mother gets old and helpless, they are stuck in an old home or little sisters of the poor. I can pay for mine, thank God." And so May did go home to Reno Tinga to live with her cousin Katie, the only other spinster in the family. May passed away in 1949 at Tinga from breast cancer and an old brain hemorrhage. May Yarowick is the first Aboriginal nurse registered within the Australian Trained Nurses Association that has been identified so far. We called it ATNA for short. It is clear from her headstone that she was proud to be a nurse, as ATNA is inscribed on it, as you can clearly see. May was not administered under the Acts and lived with a freedom denied to most other Indigenous people at this time. Her acceptance by her white family and her upbringing at Stony Creek Station afforded her with privileges and also protection. She was educated alongside her white cousins and educated to a level not common for Indigenous people at this time. May's education made it possible for her to enter midwifery training. However, she was unable to escape the haunting effect of eugenics attitudes when she was labelled as a half-caste and segregated from other trainees. For those of you who are listening tonight, and myself included, being a hospital-trained registered nurse, the thought of having to not share a room with other nurses would have been a blessing. But unfortunately, this was due to racism that May had encountered. In spite of this, May completed her training, worked a long career, and achieved independence and financial support through her own independence. In concluding, last slide, please, Sarah. In conclusion, I should say, race laws within Australia were complicated and complex. And between the 1870s and 1950s, there was an imposed and abusive system of protectionism and segregation on Indigenous peoples. The laws restricted employment opportunities and made it nearly impossible for Indigenous people to travel without permission. Most Indigenous women worked in domestic environments. Few received training to undertake a career. However, there are clear examples, which I have presented tonight, of Indigenous women being trained as nurses and midwives and navigating a career in those chosen professions. In an era of extreme race-based legislation, these women demonstrated agency over their careers. In giving voice to Indigenous women who pursued education and a career in nursing and midwifery, this research helps to reposition and extend the discourse about Indigenous women in Australia. This research creates new insights about nursing and midwifery labour in Australia before the 1950s. It also contributes to Australia's labour force history more broadly, and will continue to do so as more of these remarkable women's stories are being uncovered, such as this last slide that I show you of Isabel Ferguson, who trained during World War II in New South Wales. These gorgeous images show Isabel being thrown into the pond outside of the students' quarters, which was the ritual on graduation day. Thank you, everybody.